The day my parents raised my rent so they could keep funding my golden child brother. They looked me in the eye and expected gratitude. My mother slid the handwritten numbers across the kitchen table as casually as if she were passing the salt. My father folded his arms, refusing to meet my gaze. The old wall clock ticked louder than either of them. Outside, rain tapped against the windows, but inside the room, the silence was colder. "We know it's a lot," my mother said, almost smiling. "But you're responsible. You'll manage." My brother leaned against the counter, twirling the keys to the new SUV my parents had helped him buy just a week earlier. He didn't even bother pretending to feel guilty. He only shrugged, the corners of his mouth lifting in quiet satisfaction. Every extra dollar they demanded from me had a destination. His overdue bills, his failed business idea, his endless emergencies. Mine were never considered. I'd spent years believing that if I worked harder, stayed quieter, and caused fewer problems, eventually they'd see me the way they saw him. Instead, they discovered something else. I was dependable enough to exploit. They thought they could push me one more time. They thought I'd sigh, pick up another overtime shift, skip another vacation, postpone another dream, and keep carrying the family on my back while my brother enjoyed the view. They were wrong. I remember staring at the rental agreement spread across the table. The paper felt strangely light in my hands. My heartbeat slowed instead of racing. Something inside me, something that had been begging for permission to leave for years, finally went silent. Not defeated, certain, I nodded once, folded the agreement neatly, and thanked them for letting me know. My brother laughed. My mother looked relieved. My father assumed the conversation was over. None of them noticed that I had already stopped thinking of that house as home. They believed they had secured another year of easy money. What they had actually done was convince the only person holding their entire arrangement together to quietly walk away. And they wouldn't understand that until the first payment didn't arrive. The second bill went unpaid. And the carefully balanced illusion they had built around my brother's life began collapsing, faster than any of them imagined. I wasn't the rebellious child in the family. I was the predictable one, the first person everyone called when something broke. A bill came due, or another one of my brother's disasters needed cleaning up. Somewhere along the way, responsibility became my identity, and everyone else decided it was an unlimited resource. I'm the older sibling by 3 years. While I worked full-time, paid my own tuition through night classes, and built a stable career one paycheck at a time, my younger brother collected second chances like souvenirs. Every failed business idea became bad luck. Every missed payment became temporary. Every expensive mistake somehow turned into a family emergency that everyone else was expected to solve. My parents never said they loved him more. They didn't have to. Their priorities spoke clearly enough. When I graduated, they congratulated me over dinner. When he quit another job, they refinanced part of their savings to help him find himself. At first, I convinced myself it wasn't favoritism. I told myself they simply believed I could handle more. That lie carried me through years of paying extra rent, covering groceries, fixing things around the house, and quietly stepping in whenever money ran short. Every sacrifice earned appreciation for a day, then became an expectation forever. The hardest part wasn't losing money. It was realizing my reliability had become invisible. The more dependable I proved myself, the less anyone noticed the cost. They thanked my brother for trying, but they expected me to succeed without recognition, as though my effort required no gratitude, because failure was never an option. Friends occasionally asked why I still lived in the family duplex instead of renting somewhere else. I always gave practical reasons. It saved money. It helped my parents. It made life easier for everyone. I never admitted the real reason. I kept believing that loyalty, if practiced long enough, would eventually be returned. Instead, loyalty became the chain they used to keep me exactly where they wanted me. The rent increase wasn't an isolated decision. It was simply the first time they stopped pretending the arrangement was fair. In that quiet moment around the kitchen table, I finally understood something they never expected me to realize. They didn't value my support. They had started budgeting their entire lives around the assumption that it would never disappear. The disrespect was never loud enough for anyone else to notice. That was what made it so effective. It lived in the pauses between conversations, in the glances exchanged over my shoulder, in the quiet assumption that I would always adjust, while everyone else stayed comfortable. Whenever my brother visited, the atmosphere in the house shifted. My mother would cook his favorite meals without asking if I'd be home. My father would spend hours discussing his latest opportunity, nodding thoughtfully as if another failed venture was one brilliant idea away from success. When I walked into the room after work, the conversation would stop for half a second before picking up again. Only now it was about what needed fixing around the house. A leaking faucet, an overdue insurance payment, a broken fence. Somehow, every discussion found its way back to what I could solve. One evening, I found a stack of unopened utility bills on the kitchen counter with my name written neatly across the top. My father didn't even look up from the television. "Take care of those when you get a chance," he said, as though assigning me another chore. Across the room, my brother was showing our mother pictures of a weekend trip he'd taken with friends. She laughed at every story, admiring restaurants and hotels that cost more than my monthly grocery budget. No one mentioned where the money had come from. I didn't ask. I already knew. The pattern repeated itself so often that it became almost invisible. My birthday dinners were quietly rescheduled because my brother wasn't available. Family gatherings started late because they were waiting for him. Yet if I arrived 10 minutes behind schedule, someone would glance at the clock with obvious disappointment. The smallest moments revealed the truth more clearly than the biggest arguments ever could. One Saturday morning, I replaced the aging water heater after spending 6 hours in the basement. My clothes were damp with sweat, my hands scraped raw from rusted fittings. When I finally came upstairs, exhausted but satisfied, my parents barely looked away from the dining table. My brother had just arrived carrying coffee. They thanked him first. I stood there for a moment, unnoticed, listening to them praise his thoughtfulness while muddy footprints from my work still stretched across the hallway floor. That was when I stopped waiting for appreciation. Instead, I started paying attention. And once I began watching instead of hoping, I noticed something else. They weren't simply taking me for granted anymore. They were making plans that only worked if I never realized my own worth. The moment that changed everything didn't come with an argument or a slammed door. It arrived on an ordinary Tuesday evening, carrying a folder my father accidentally left open on the dining table. I wasn't searching for secrets. I was looking for a pen. As I reached across the table, my eyes caught a spreadsheet filled with monthly expenses. My rent was listed in careful handwriting beside the mortgage payment. A few lines below it was another entry simply labeled Ryan Support. The numbers matched almost perfectly. I stood there longer than I meant to, listening to the refrigerator hum while the realization settled over me. My increased rent wasn't helping keep the house afloat. It wasn't paying for repairs or rising taxes like they'd claimed. It was replacing the money they were giving my brother every single month. When my parents walked in, I quietly closed the folder exactly where I'd found it. They smiled as though nothing had happened. For the first time, I smiled back without believing them. That evening, I drove around for nearly an hour with the radio off. Streetlights drifted across the windshield like slow-moving memories. I replayed years of conversations in my head, and suddenly every excuse fit together with perfect clarity. Every unexpected expense. Every request to help just this once. Every promise that things would be different next month. There had never been a next month. There had only been me. Oddly enough, I didn't feel angry anymore. Anger demanded energy, and I had already spent enough of mine carrying people who never intended to walk beside me. What replaced it was something quieter. Permission. I realized I didn't need to expose them, argue with them, or convince anyone they had treated me unfairly. The truth would reveal itself the moment I stopped protecting them from the consequences of their own choices. So I made a decision that night. I found a modest apartment across town, signed the lease before the weekend, redirected my paycheck into a new account, and arranged the move without telling a single member of my family. No dramatic announcement. No threats. No final speech. Just a carefully packed life, one box at a time. They believed they had secured another dependable payment. I knew they had just received their last one. I spent the next 2 weeks acting exactly as I always had. I left for work at the same time every morning, came home carrying groceries, paid my usual bills, and answered every question with the same calm tone. If anything, I became easier to live with. Familiar routines are comforting, and I wanted them to feel completely secure. At work, planning was part of my job. Years of managing contracts and budgets had taught me one lesson above all else. People rarely prepare for problems they don't believe can happen. My parents had built their finances around certainty, and that certainty was me. I wasn't interested in proving a point. I was interested in protecting myself. I reviewed every document with the same care I gave to project proposals. I confirmed the terms of my rental agreement, photographed the condition of my apartment, and kept copies of every payment I'd made over the years. There would be no confusion about what I owed, or what I didn't. The lease on my new apartment was signed electronically during my lunch break. Utilities were transferred before moving day. My mail was redirected. My savings account was moved to a different bank, and every automatic payment was updated one by one. No loose ends. One Saturday, while my parents spent the afternoon helping my brother look at another business location, professional movers loaded my furniture into a truck. I had deliberately chosen that day because I knew the house would be empty. By sunset, my old apartment was spotless. The keys rested neatly on the kitchen counter beside a short note. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't emotional. It simply explained that I had accepted a new lease elsewhere, that my rent payments would end immediately, and that I wished them well. I locked the front door for the last time and slipped the key through the mail slot. As I walked back to my car, I glanced at the windows where I'd spent years trying to earn a place that was never truly mine. For the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was leaving home. I felt like I was leaving a responsibility that had never belonged to me. The consequences waiting inside that empty house no longer belonged to me either. 3 days passed before my phone rang. I was sitting on the balcony of my new apartment, watching the evening sun settle behind the neighboring buildings, when my mother's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring once before answering. Her voice was calm at first, but I could hear the strain beneath it. "There must be some misunderstanding," she said. The mortgage payment bounced. I looked across the quiet parking lot, saying nothing for a moment. "There isn't a misunderstanding," I replied. I moved. The silence that followed was longer than any argument we had ever shared. By the end of the week, the calls became more frequent. My father sounded less confident with each conversation. He explained that the budget had been thrown off unexpectedly, that they only needed temporary help, that my brother was working on a solution. I knew what that solution looked like. Another promise, another delay, another rescue they expected someone else to provide. Except this time, there was no one left standing behind him. Without my monthly rent covering the gap, the numbers stopped cooperating. Bills that had quietly been postponed demanded attention. Credit cards reached their limits. The generous support they had always extended to my brother suddenly had a visible cost. For the first time, they had to choose: support him or stabilize their own finances. It was a choice they had postponed for years because my paycheck had allowed them to avoid making it. I didn't celebrate. I didn't tell relatives what had happened or post cryptic messages online. I simply continued living the life I'd finally built for myself. Weeks later, my father left a voicemail I listened to only once. He admitted they hadn't realized how much they depended on me. That sentence lingered in my mind long after the message ended. Not because it was an apology, because it was the first honest thing anyone in that house had said in years. The collapse they feared hadn't been caused by my leaving. It had been caused by the fragile foundation they had chosen to build long before. I quietly walked away, and for the first time, I let that foundation stand, or fall, without trying to hold it up. The hardest part for my family wasn't losing the money. It was losing the version of me they thought would always exist. My relatives noticed the change before anyone admitted it. The invitations became less casual. The conversations became more careful. People who had spent years hearing only my parents' side of the story began, asking questions when the usual family rescuer was suddenly unavailable. My brother was the first to struggle publicly. Without my parents quietly absorbing the consequences of his decisions, his confidence disappeared. The new business idea he had been preparing required actual planning instead of another emergency loan. Friends who once saw him as ambitious started seeing the pattern everyone else had ignored. My parents changed too, but not overnight. At first there was frustration, then disappointment, then silence. They expected me to eventually feel guilty enough to return. I didn't. That was the part they understood least. They thought my distance was punishment. It wasn't. It was peace. For years, I measured my worth by how much I could provide. I believed being needed meant being loved. Walking away forced me to learn the difference. I rebuilt my life slowly. I decorated my apartment with things I actually liked. I saved money without wondering who would need it next. I made plans without checking whether someone else's problems would interrupt them. Eventually, my mother apologized. Not a perfect apology, not one that erased everything, but a real one. She admitted they had confused my strength with endless availability. I accepted her words, but I didn't return to my old role. That was the lesson my family, and maybe anyone watching this story, needed to understand. Sometimes the most powerful response to being undervalued isn't revenge. It's removing access to the person who kept saving everyone else while quietly losing themselves. A year after I left, I drove past my old neighborhood for the first time. The street looked exactly the same. The same trees lined the sidewalks. The same porch lights glowed through the evening fog. For a moment, I expected to feel the old weight in my chest. The feeling that I was abandoning people who needed me. But it never came. Instead, I felt calm. My relationship with my parents didn't return to what it was before, and I don't think it ever should. Some things can be repaired, but they cannot be forgotten. Trust is not rebuilt by promises. It is rebuilt through consistent choices over time. My mother and I speak more now. Our conversations are different. She asks how I am before asking what I can do. My father is quieter, more thoughtful. He no longer assumes I will automatically step in whenever something goes wrong. As for my brother, he finally learned a lesson. No one could teach him while protecting him from consequences. He started working, budgeting, and making decisions based on reality instead of rescue. I don't hate him. That surprised me the most. For years, I thought peace would come from watching them struggle without me. But peace came from realizing their struggles were never mine to carry. The greatest thing I gained wasn't a new apartment, more savings, or distance from my family. It was the understanding that my value was never measured by how much I sacrificed. I spent years trying to prove I was worth keeping around. In the end, the moment I walked away was the moment I finally chose myself.